Hi, hi.
So, how are Pradipta? What is happening?
Everything fine. What about you?
Okay. Carry on.
Surviving, most
Surviving,
important.
yeah. One has to be just cautious.
Because much excitement because of the elections.
I know, true. There is a surge of COVID cases in Delhi.
Yeah, it has jumped
Mm.
over 7,000 a day.
Yeah.
So it's in bad shape, very bad shape.
So the winter impact is now.
They were expecting it,
Mm.
but it's everywhere. It's kind of exceeding all the limits.
True.
And how are things there in Hyderabad?
Hyderabad is under control.
Okay.
But never know what will happen. The people
Yeah.
also coming out openly without mask.
Oh, I
There
see.
is risk involved,
Oh. Now in
Especially.
Delhi, they're a little strict, so people don't cover their full face, at least the nose and the mouth. Sometimes they keep the nose open, but they're quite strict about enforcing it. So people do wear masks.
True.
No, but a lot of places they don't actually.
Yeah. So give me 1 minute, I'll come from bathroom.
Sure.
Pradeep.
Yeah.
Nice to see you after a long time. This is Vishnu here.
Oh, hi, Vishnu. How are you?
All right, good. Where are you?
I'm in Delhi now.
Oh, okay, good.
I just retired a couple of months ago in June.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I now stay at home and work. But that was what I was doing also during the lockdown period. So
yeah, right.
Not much of a change.
And let's catch up sometime.
Yes.
I've been all right. I've been settling between a place near Chennai and Delhi.
So, where is this?
This is a new university called Kriya. That's where I am.
Okay, yeah. I've heard, I know about it, yes.
And I joined in 2018.
Okay, so you've been there for some time now.
Yeah, I was there as its founding dean.
Oh, really? I see.
So we just
and
started.
How are you liking it? Must be very challenging.
I think it has a lot of promise. I mean, as you know, all private institution would have its own problem, but I think, but it has a promise. It has we have hired a lot of young people. And
that's excellent.
I mean, looks promising at this point in time.
Oh, that's very.
So Pradeep, let's catch up sometime.
Sure. You have my email.
I'll get it from Arun. I'm sure
it'll be in this whole list. Yeah. So
I'll drop a line. Yeah.
Sure. And
sorry.
Then we can get in touch. That'll be very nice. Yeah.
The group mail ID. He has a mail ID. Yeah. How Bhudev? How are you?
I
can't see you.
Audible? I mean, I'm trying to.
Yeah, you are audible, but
where are you?
Now you are visible. Fine.
Hi, Bhudev.
Hi, PK. How are you?
Surviving.
I'm trying to. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, I thought. Okay, great. Yes. So excellent initiative, I must say, Arun. I'm really looking forward to. I did manage to read PK. I did whatever I could understand, and I thought it was really interesting. Some of the bits you've put together. It's very, very complex coming from outside and somebody who doesn't know too much of Bhadro history.
That's a nice term.
It is all about that. I mean, only a Bhadro could dream like that. The whole world is collapsing, and here he was dreaming. So it was very interesting, and I like that bit about political and social that you made. I was interested in that. Now, somewhere in that essay, you've
right.
separates the political and social.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think, and it's a very interesting kind of formulation, to see this dream. Amazing, very, very, provocative, I would say.
Achha. Good.
Looking forward to, more people are joining in, I'm sure. So, otherwise, you're doing well, PK, before I...
I've retired, as you know.
Of course, but you are very active. We also know that.
So now I'm doing what I used to do before in the time of the lockdown, which is stay at home.
Okay. They're going to announce a lockdown. That is what the rumor is today. Because of the large numbers, they might announce a lockdown in the NCR region, So I don't know how much this is holding, but I think they're worried that there are so many.
Yeah, because it's just every day it's increasing by 1,000.
Hyderabad is not so bad, is it, Arun?
No, not very bad. It's under control, but never know.
Hey, Rajiv.
Hi.
It's written Pani. Just wondering.
Oh, hi, Rajiv.
Hi, PK. Hi. I'm just going to remove the video and the audio so that I can
even I'm going to do that. I
have
think.
clarity of sound.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. Hello, Vaidik. How are you? Ansuman, Vaidik. Hi.
Namaskar. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Hello, sir.
You are able to hear us, Vaidik?
Yes, I can.
Hi, Vaidik.
Hi.
Shauna is the other person, right, in the panelist? Arun?
Yeah.
The three of us,
Yeah,
actually, four maybe.
Shauna is also there. Shauna was my student.
Yeah, Shauna.
She's from JNU before she left for
Acha.
PhD. Yeah, she's
Yeah.
MA. Her MA and MPhil in CPS. She's very much our student.
Yeah.
Today is quite a hurrah day. I don't know where it will go, but at least in the US, there's some good news.
I know.
The way people are cracking jokes since morning is just amazing. He's playing golf. Trump is playing golf.
Really a bit like Nero.
Yes, very, very much. Now reminds us so much of that history.
His boats have gone inside the holes. So therefore he has gone to go golf club.
No, but he's not going to give up. He's going to begin all this legal battle. Let's get ready for a long discussion on this, I suppose.
I don't know, he will do that, but I already lost 4 cases. He will continuously lose. He won't live in anyone. No substantial evidence.
I think the Republican Party should think a little ahead. I mean, what do they think they're going to emerge? How will they emerge out of this? I can see Sanjeev coming.
Sanjeev is coming now. He might also switch off. Good evening, Sanjeev. We can't see you. Are you able to hear us? Lot of network problem, Pradita.
Yeah.
Everywhere, even in Santiniketan, you have network issues.
In terms of?
Network issues. You can't.
Oh, yeah.
Network. Yes.
Major issues. Yeah.
Yeah. Calcutta is better than Santiniketan.
Shantiniketan is bound to be far worse, actually. Yeah.
Hi, Ranu. Hi. Ritvik is coming.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hello, Dr. Datta. Can you recognize me?
Hello.
I'm Ranu Jain. I was a scholar in CSSE.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, Ranu. Acha, yeah. How are you? You're looking
I'm fine.
different.
I'm fine. How are you, sir? It's so nice to see you.
Yeah. I'm surviving like everybody else. How have you been?
All right. Sorry.
Hi, Ritik.
Hi. Sorry. Yeah. How are you? Sorry.
Yeah. And Ranu, how have you been?
I'm all right, sir. Working in Tata Institute of Social Sciences.
Achha.
And till now, the institute has been quite kind. So it's quite all right.
Oh, that's very nice.
How are you now?
Yeah, I'm fine.
You're in Kolkata?
No, Delhi.
Okay.
You
used to be in center when I was.
That's right. Yes. Then I returned to Delhi University, and then I joined JNU, and now I'm retired. I just retired a couple of months ago.
Should I congratulate you? I'm slightly dreading my retirement.
No, you can congratulate me.
If you're in a central university, it's not a bad idea.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're in JNU, it's an even better idea.
Any day, retirement any day, not a bad idea.
And it's I'm just coming in a second.
So Arun, how are you?
Fine.
And the papers are very interesting, Arun. I was very happy reading them.
Okay.
I think Shauna I can see somewhere. Hi, Shauna. Long time, huh? So good to see you. Yeah. After all those days of Machiavelli, and now I find you've gone into Islam, huh? I was seeing your chapter the other day. It was really good. The one you've given to Akash.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Kaviraj, how are you?
I'm okay. How are you?
Well, as I was telling PK's just taken a break. I must admit, I didn't understand all of it, but the little Bhadro dream that he got, it's kept me quite captivated in the last few days. So I'm still trying to figure out where this is going. And I hope this will help me today to understand.
I'm still recovering from the shock of the election.
Oh, yes. I mean, that we were just saying what a nice day it is for the US. So at least, there's something to celebrate there while we are still wondering where we are going. Just coping with
rather than soft.
So should we start? Is PK there?
PK has gone out. He'll back in a minute.
Okay. No, I just wanted to ask, in fact, what is the order we should follow? Should we start with Shauna and then Ritik and then PK?
Start with Shauna first.
Okay. So, am I chairing the meeting?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think we should start.
We'll start now, yeah. Others will join. I will. Okay. So I welcome all my friends to the second session of Indian Thought Collective, and it's going to be a very interesting session today. I request Professor Kaviraj to chair this session, and it will be addressed by Professor Pradeep Datta, Sona Rodriguez, and Vaidik Bhattacharya. So I request for Kaviraj to chair this session.
Not me, Professor Patnaik, it's someone else.
Sorry,
not Ritik.
Ritik, yeah, I forgot.
Okay, all right. So I don't want to take much time. I'll just introduce everybody in one sentence. But we have decided that we should start, I think, the way we should, with Shona, and then Ritik, and then Bhudev. So Shona is a political science, political theory student. She did her earlier education at JNU, so she has a strong connection with a lot of people here. And she's doing her PhD in my department, where I and Partha teach together at Columbia. Yeah. Should I introduce all of them? Let me do that. Ritik, you have to help me. The sense that Ritik, I think, was also educated in Kolkata. I think he did his very early research, I think, MPhil or something at the Calcutta Center with Partha. And then he came to do his PhD at Princeton. I think he did an excellent PhD on Bengali political thought, which covered Bankim, which intensified my interest in his work. And he had lots of very interesting things to say. He did that at Princeton a few years back. And now I think he's a postdoc in the University of Shanghai. Is that right, Ritik?
It's New York University, Shanghai.
Oh, New York University, Shanghai. And Pradeep Datta, of course, doesn't need introduction. We all know him and his work. He was in Delhi University at one time, but now I think he teaches in JNU in the Center for Political. Is it called Center for Political Theory?
I've just retired. I was its Center for Comparative Politics and Political Theory. I retired in June.
Oh, I see. Okay, that doesn't matter. That gives you more time to be more of a professor, than when you were unretired.
To profess, certainly.
Okay, so we'll start with Shona. We are going to read Bhudev Mukhopadhyay's short book. It's called Shopnolabdha Bharatbarshir Itihas, written in Bangla. Bhudev, in my judgment, was one of the most interesting and original thinkers about social theory in 19th century Bengal. Except for Shopnolabdha Bharatbarshir Itihas, I don't think we have other translations of Bhudev's work. So we decided that we should start reading him with something that is available in English. It was translated, I think, by Shujit Mukherjee, who also translated Tagore's Gora. The most recent translation of Gora is by Shujit Mukherjee. Yeah, Shona.
Thank you so much, Professor. I'm just going to pull up all my notes. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be speaking today, and I'm excited to have this discussion. And I haven't slept because it's just been, I'm in the States right now, and I've just been watching the election news. So I might not necessarily be entirely coherent. I just wanted to say that I've learned a lot from previous sections, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. Let me first start by making 2 points. First is that most of us probably tuned into Kamala Harris and Joe Biden's victory speeches last night. Many of us might have felt some relief to not see Trump at the helm of, the most powerful political institution in the world, maybe. But Biden and Harris both emphasized an idea of politics and the political, which can shape not just power, but also be something that is foundational to shaping human action. I'd like us to keep this idea of politics and the political as an analytical counter view to the viewpoint that we are discussing today. I would argue that an analytical counter is distinct from an ideological counter. Ideology is constituted by a cluster of concepts that direct thought, action, institutions, and structures to maintain consistency with a conviction that individuals, groups, or societies at large employ to reduce the amount of active rethinking that one has to do when encountering a political phenomenon. An analytic, on the other hand, focuses on how concepts are clustering together, how such concepts are circumscribed, and pays attention to what emerges as a prominent argument from such a clustering. So these are very sort of stand-in kind of distinctions that I'm making for this purpose of reading this text. The second point that I want to make at the start is to highlight something that is fairly evident. We have in our first 3 meetings of this group read the works of men who are identified predominantly as Bengali and predominantly as upper caste. And the point of raising this point is not merely to demand greater representation for a diverse range of sources and persons from which political thought in India emerges, but it is to ask what analytical losses or gains are involved in repeatedly thinking about the space that is India as a whole, the political that constitutes it in the last 2 centuries, and the concepts that we recurringly discuss via this domain of thinking, which is Bengali intellectual thought, and by reading thinkers who have been characterized as I just described above. At the same time, while raising these questions, I want to argue that there is a deep relevance to Indian political thought in closely reading thinkers like Bhudev Mukhopadhyay. Bhudev helps drive across analytics, which, whether they hold true or not, especially in today's India, are constant reference points in thinking about political thought in India. I have now roughly drawn about maybe seven categories and ideas that I thought are coming through very strongly in this text. First is the force of what our readings translate as a social character. The translation that we are reading, and which I'm entirely reliant on because I don't read Bengali, translates the term social character at the start of the text, and this social character is seen as foundational to the conduct of those Bhudev is dreaming of. And it's foundational predominantly to the character of those Bhudev is dreaming of as Hindus. And it is important to note, and he's not just dreaming about them, he's systematically writing about them too. So I think it's important to note that the social character does not influence the conduct of all human beings in Bhudev's writing, but in particular those of Hindus. And it is this social character that shapes power and human action. So as a counter to the idea of what Biden and Harris gave us last night, we have an idea like this. What are then the analytical losses and gains that are made in thinking of politics through conduct based on social character, and shifting the grounds of thinking of politics in relation to a universal category of humans to that of politics in relation to the 2 major categories in this text, which is Hindus and Muslims? I just want to kick off the discussion on this point by noting that Hindus and Muslims appear to be more than just simple categories of identity in Bhudev's text. they don't seem to be religious categories either. What then do these terms stand for? And what is the problematic in the Althusserian sense that seems to be circumscribing them? Because he doesn't give us descriptions for who these are. It seems to be evident. But at the same time, they're not categories of identity in the way in which we understand identity today as political concepts. And I have lots of thoughts on this. I come in during discussion. Okay, let me come to my second point, which is that on the imaginary of what is translated in our text as the land that is India, this land, besides being personified, etc., has an agentic quality to it in the text. And that is because it acts in such a way that, at least in Bhudev's imagination, allows for intimate relations that are analogous to familiar ones between Hindus and Muslims.
ఓకే బాబాయ్ ఎంత జన కొంచెం జూమ్ లెక్చర్ నాకు ఇప్పుడు
Arun, can't you mute him?
Shauna, you are muted.
Yeah, thanks. So let me come back to this, what I found so interesting about land and the agentic quality of land, because I find it a sort of repetitive trope in a lot of Indian political texts, especially those that deal with diversity. And often Hindu-Muslim diversity seems to be predicated on the land that is India and what this land has given these two communities who are Hindu and Muslim. In Bhudev's text, the relation that they get from land is that of a familial relation. But at the same time, he argues that Muslims are alien to this land. So let me come to my third point. But I just wanted to put this on the table about the sort of beyond the person, beyond the embodiment of land as Mother India, etc. Why does land gain such a dramatic agency in the text? And I just wanted to ask someone who's read the text closely also what the word for land is in it. Okay, my third point, and this is a more ambiguous point, is about it's about religion at large, and the different ways in which it appears in the text. God is central to the conversation. And there is this moment in the text which almost seems like a break in the text, because it's not seamless with the rest of the text, where he talks about the unity of God and how this is, this is in the section on the conversation in Jama Masjid. And both Hindus and Muslims believe that there is some kind of unity in the idea of God that Hindus and Muslims have in India. But the reflection of God and the unity of God is not theoretical, but it remains at the level of finding analogies or examples. And this is also another, fairly common trope in Indian political thought, except when one turns to Islamic political thought, where we find a far more theoretical use of the idea of unity of God, because it is such a strong idea within Islamic traditions. And I'm wondering if Bhudev is using this argument, where it is coming from, what the source of that argument is. The second subpoint I have on religion is how he describes religion of a nation. So this term comes up fairly often, that nations have religions, and the religion of the Indian nation or of Bharatvarsha is Hinduism. And he doesn't mention the word Islam. However, whatever it is that Muslims seem to represent seem to be indicating a religion which is Islam. It doesn't, it doesn't necessarily mention the word Hinduism either, if I remember correctly. So there is, however, in the text, he says in one section of the text, he proclaims that there are people of, there is a project where there is an idea to create create the overlaps between Vedas abiding Hindus, Quran abiding Muslims, the Bible abiding Christians. And religion therefore seems to be constituted, at least in that section of the text, by how people abide by a certain idea of a text. And he says that all of them are people of the book. It's a section of the text where one cannot help but avoid the recent, reading it via the recent literature on the secular, because it sort of directly speaks to this argument on how there is a mutual constitutedness of the religious and the political. There is the argument in the recent literature on secularism is that, coming from people like Talal Asad, is that there is a mutual constitutedness of the religion and of the religious and the political. And this argument has an idea of how power shapes how we have ignored this mutual constitutedness, but that power is constantly directed towards the idea of an imperial power. In that reading, if we were to read this text via the way in which Talal Asad understands religion, Bhudev would appear to be someone who's adopting a modern imperial mode of thinking in order to understand what Hinduism is. So it's complex terrain because Bhudev does not necessarily say Hinduism is a religion, but he constantly talks about Vedas abiding. He doesn't constantly talk about it, but he clearly mentions the importance of Vedas abiding Hindus. And the idea that people of the book are mutually constituted, not in the way in which we historically understand people of the book, but by certain overlaps that might exist between the adherence that different people have to different ideas of the text. So it complicates the way in which we have understood ideas of religion and the political. And we're left again with a lot of questions. So I have a lot to say on this, which I'll come back to later in the discussion. Fourth, Bhudev was located in a madrasa. That institution, which the theorist Shahab Ahmed argues was foundational to an Islamic imaginary that extended from the Balkans to Bengal. The writings by Bhudev that we are reading today are not on Bengal, but they are based on a historical period that he lived in, the writings that we're reading by Bhudev are not on Bengal. They're actually engaging with figures and ideas that are both temporally and spatially removed from Bengal in that historical period. Why does he choose to write about these distant characters, despite clearly deriving?
You should finish in another 5 minutes, right?
Okay, cool. Thank you, Professor. I've finished soon. So why does he choose to write about these distant characters, despite clearly deriving norms of his daily life from the Shastras? And in my reading, this has less to do with nationalism and more to do with the imaginary of a political community that is attached to a place that is India. So one of the questions that I want to place here is, if this analytical choice had anything to do with his location at the madrasa in particular, what is causing him to build this sort of larger idea of India that seems to be extending far beyond Bengal? Okay, fifth is the centrality of space and place to this text. Every story starts with a certain reflection on the spaces that the stories occupy. So there is the description of the Jama Masjid as being at the center of spider's web. The argument that Indians should travel to foreign lands in order to understand what is happening elsewhere. And the idea that the space that Bharatvarsha occupies is not just landed, but oceanic too. So the idea of space that is emerging from this text and its centrality to Indian history in the way in which Bhudev describes it is not just connected to land, it's also connected to the ocean. And therefore we get a sediment of time which is not necessarily entirely landed. It's very fascinating. I just want to put it out there, and we can come back to it later. Let me come to my final point about caste and the way in which caste seems to be operating as an analytic in the text. It is not described as a social structure, except when we are reading letters that he seems to be summarizing by, this Jesuit in, German and American to places elsewhere outside of India. And caste is not operating as a social structure in those letters. It is operating as an episteme. So this text starts with a reference to caste and ends with a reference to caste, almost as if to frame the way in which thinking about India necessarily implies understanding how there is an epistemic way in which caste frames everyday practices, caste frames thinking about space, and I don't think Bhudev is necessarily thinking about equality or hierarchy. This is not his concern. So the point about caste is not to question the presence or the absence of equality or hierarchy, but what the idea itself is doing in the text. And so I'm gonna stop there and sort of maybe make a few more points in the discussion. Yeah, thank you. Professor, you're muted.
Thanks, Shauna, for reading the text closely and starting us off. So we turn to Ritik.
Thank you, Professor, and thanks, Shauna. And I was really hoping that I would be the third speaker, because if you see the email, I was the third speaker there. So I didn't prepare much, thinking that everything will be covered by PK and Shauna already. So I wouldn't have much to say. But let me just begin by saying that I am now in Wuhan, China, where it all started. I'm traveling to Shanghai, but I'm now observing 14 days of isolation, because that's what they want Indians to do when they visit China now. And so I was thinking that, there was this book called Reading Lolita in Tehran by Azhar Nafisi. And if I ever get to reflect on my experience here in China during the pandemic, I would probably write something like Reading Bhudev in Wuhan, thanks to this reading group. So having said that, let me first acknowledge that my teachers here, the people I have loved and looked up to and read again and again, Professor Kaviraj and Professor P.K. Datta, they are the real, how to put it, they know Bhudev much better than I would ever be able to, so I don't know what to say. So, but regardless, since I would have to say something, I would do but let me tell you that because I was thinking that I would be the third speaker, I didn't really prepare anything directly to speak on the text, but I wanted to situate Bhudev and how to think about SBI in particular in the context of the current debates which are going on in historiography. So let me quickly begin. Therefore, that now there is this trend, as we know, of post-narrativism. You had a long, like 3 decades or so, when you had Hayden White and his followers who dominated the field of historiography, but now several other voices are challenging that. So I could name a few, but especially I would like to name Eva Domanska, who wrote on this idea of returning to the things, right? So this return to the things sort of movement, which asks us to deal with history in a way which wouldn't be directly through the narratives of history, sort of. So that is a kind of new emerging tendency. But at the same time, in Indian history, we know that there is a concern about the genre of history itself. So I can think of two specific texts which I would want to mention. One is Textures of Time by 3 authors, Chirru Narayana Rao, Sanjay Subramaniam, and mainly these two. And so these, what these authors are arguing is they are talking about a cultural ecology where, which enabled certain texts to be read as both history and something which is not quite history. So the fact fiction division in pre-modern India, southern India, it was something which was habitual in a way. The listeners, when they belong to certain communities, they would be able to make that distinction. So our reading of certain texts as unhistorical or something which is clearly not history might be wrong, because those communities in their times, they knew how to read those texts as both history and, say, fiction at the same time. So there is this intention to distinguish between fact and fiction, even when these authors are dealing with pre-modern texts which they want to claim as history. Similarly, if you think of Ramila Thapar, she talks about in her recent book, recent meaning like still 5 years back, I think, there was this book called The Past Before Us, where she deals with, again, pre-modern traditions of historical writing. And there too, you will find a kind of vocabulary which is very interesting. You start with embedded histories, then they're externalized, and then you reach sort of a genre like history, right? So almost the movement of history, history of history, is towards what we now know as history, right? The genre of history. So these sort of tendencies, could they be questioned? And if this could be related, then this questioning could be related to how Bhudev is using history, for instance. So I wanted to quickly go through how in the West, for instance, some authors, some very famous big names, they have actually questioned the of the equation which is often done between historiography and history. So in Being and Time, for instance, there's a clear distinction being made between history by Heidegger, between history and Geschichte, right? So he has this pairs of terms like history, Historizität, and Geschichtlichkeit and Geschichte. Historicity and history, they would never be equal, right? So he says something like the societies which do not have history, they do not really mean, therefore, it doesn't really mean, therefore, that they are naturally, automatically unhistorical, right? So he complicates the relationship between historicity and history as a genre of writing. But if you go back further, if you look at one of the inspirations of Heidegger's, like Nietzsche, you will find a similar kind of distinction being made by Nietzsche in his use and abuse of history for life, right? And there you have this, he says at a certain point, he says, it is only true that by the power to use the past to live and to make history out of what happened, man becomes man, right? And the word he uses is here Geschichte, right? And then, but forgive my German pronunciation, but that's the word, right? I don't know how to pronounce it exactly. But then he goes to, he adds this line, but in an excess of history, man stops again. And there the word is history, right? The narrative. So excess of narrative of history somehow impedes people from making history. And this then, is taken up again by someone like Koselleck, who will say, making history is a very modern way of looking at history. And that actually takes history away from history as narratives. So history is as an object determined by narration is removed, and in its place is put the history as a malleable sort of object. You make the future, you make history, right? And this he actually points out by sort of tracking the word, how the word history then disappears or becomes less frequent, and how the word Geschichte appears through the latter half of the 18th century. So all this I'm trying to sort of point out precisely because we usually, when we discuss in Indian context history, we often sort of veer towards historiography. But if you think of the conceptual history tradition, like Koselleck, for instance, he's talking about many incompatible ideas of history. It wouldn't necessarily be historiography, right? He's talking about, for instance, how the tendency to predict the future in the medieval era, Christian predictions of the future, that gradually declines, and its space is then occupied by a rational prognosis and historical process of a philosophy of historical process, right? So you have the prognosis and you have then the philosophy of history. These two actually occupy that space. Now, why is it interesting for us to think of Bhudev? What Koselleck is, meaning by historical prognosis is this various possible futures that one has in mind, an actor, historical actor has in mind, before it even is realized, right? So the very idea of alternate history, right, as a kind of speculative horizon where many things are possible, future is malleable to an extent. This sort of idea is therefore, it appears, according to Koselleck, between this emergence of initially this trend of declining sort of prophecy, Christian prophecy's decline, and the emergence of the philosophy of history through Kant and then post-Kantian philosophers. So you have this, in between these, you have this era of, or this time when rational prognosis becomes a very widespread practice in Europe. So this is what Koselleck is talking about. Now, this I find interesting precisely because when I have been reading P.K. Datta's essay on Bhudev's SBI, and there I find it's very interesting that he's telling us it's very difficult to categorize what Bhudev is doing. This particular text, it cannot be called a historical romance, right? Because it's all about public events, right? It's confined to public events. But at the same time, it's not really talking about these big ruptures in time. So Kali Yuga, in Hindu tradition, or the second coming of the Christian tradition, these are some of the ideas that Bhudev is avoiding, right? And PK even tells us that Bhudev is actually what he produces reads like an impersonal bureaucratic report. So it's neither literature. It couldn't be history, of course, because history deals with what has happened. So it's something else. It's a third thing, and this actually goes pretty well, I think, with this idea of prognosis. So Bhudev is in a way producing a kind of rational prognosis, or maybe a history of rational prognosis, right? What could have happened if there is a speculative horizon present to an actor, historical actor. What would be the history of that speculative horizon, right, in the past? So this is one such probably moment when Bhudev then discusses the other options that were available to the actors, how one particular event could have changed, and that could have changed then all the other subsequent events and all the other subsequent decisions taken by historical actors at that given time, right? And this is what I wanted to point out. So could we call this history, or could we call this then this thing which wouldn't quite go with our traditional idea of history, or the way we discuss it, historiography even widely now? And I think this is also compatible with what Professor Kaviraj has said in his essay. The one which, there were two, and the one which especially discusses concepts from Bhudev's Shamajik Prabandha, right? Social essays, right? Like perfectibility, like progress, that one I'm talking about. So let me read a small quote from there. Modernity is about perfectibility, and it is by definition a time which has no end, right? Hindu thought is more skeptical about both these ideas. First, about the perfectibility of man, and secondly, about the unendingness of the triumph of of European modernity. For Hindu thought, human beings have a fundamentally finite and definite set of characteristics which cannot be improved or stretched. So the task of philosophy is to find ways of finding contentment and happiness within those eternally limited terms, not foolishly to try to stretch them. So this sort of idea of rejection of modernity as perfectibility, or rejection of the triumph of European modernity, this actually could go very well with kind of rational prognosis, which does not desire this utopian future, or it does not desire this human perfectibility. It's all about calculations, it's all about now, but it's also about this speculative horizon where other things could have happened. And so my suggestion would be that we have been for long, we have been very focused on historiography and the idea of historiography. And now that there are criticisms from certain camps, and now that narrativism is being criticized, perhaps we could think of Bhudev as offering us, through this text SBI, a concept of history which is somewhat incompatible with how we would otherwise think history, right? And maybe prognosis is a good way to think about it, but that also makes us take conceptual history sometimes more seriously than we do, because narratives and focusing on narratives, which narrativism does, is a very legitimate project, but conceptual history is another kind of project which shows us that there was never a single concept of history, and there were even like serious incompatibilities between these various concepts. So I think Bhudev is therefore, to me personally, extremely interesting, because he forces me to rethink history and its various conceptualizations. So thank you.
Thanks, Ritik, again, for giving us very interesting angles, to think about it. I particularly thought that, the last point that you made, very interesting, that on the one side, if you unpack what you said and link it to the kind of analysis that we have in Koselleck, I think it's quite clear that he's responding to the rational prognosis idea, but he also doesn't go in the direction of the standard European way of thinking about history. So we turn now to Pradeep, who is undoubtedly the most well-informed amongst us about Bhudev and particularly Swapnalabdha Bharatvarshik Itihas. And I would give you a bit more time if you want, because
no, not really. I mean, I'm okay with 10 minutes or so.
But we have also read the paper, I assume. I actually gained enormously by reading the paper. So
okay,
no, you can take about 20 minutes, and then we can open it up to discussion.
Yeah, well, actually, I assume that the paper is already there, so I'm, and it's been many years since I wrote it, so I didn't actually prepare a longish sort of thing. But let me first thank Arun and Sudipto again for initiating this process. Thank Shauna and Ritik for actually, exploring so many interesting avenues of thinking about SBI, which many of which I haven't thought about. So I've learned quite a lot within this last 20-25 minutes. So thank you very much. I'll just have a shortish presentation because it's really a kind of play off against what I had written. And let me also just say that much of my thinking on Bhudev has actually been prepared for by Sudipto. So, and it's also in a way playing off against Sudipto's foundational sort of formulations that he's made about Bhudev and the basic inquiry, which I thought was extremely important and central point for Indian political thought in general. So let me just start by saying that for me, Bhudev is a very challenging thinker, precisely because of the frankness of his conservatism. He is clearly not part of a we. You know, this question had come up at the end of last discussion. Part of a we that we can identify with. And we, I'm talking about me, especially that is of a left liberal way of thinking. He is Brahminical with a strong male bias, as well as a colonial attitude to Adivasis and to many parts of the country, including Assam. Southern India does not seem to be represented in SBI. And of course, he is afflicted with strong monarchical sentiments. All of this for me is actually part of a challenge of recuperating, and I underline the word challenge, of recuperating the genealogy of modern thought of India. How do we recover some of his general principles, even as we may differ with some of its basic premises, which in many ways is still functioning in our society today, unlike, say, the slave society of Greek thought? The basic question that the counterfactual romance, I've called it romance in that essay, but the counterfactual part of that romance of SBI poses is what would happen if we had been able to or can control our future. And this, this kind of rational prognosis argument that what could have happened if we had been able to, or as we can control our future, both of these as a part of the actual, I think, part of the tease, the historical tease of SBI and part of the perplexity it poses, an interesting and very productive perplexity. I want to discuss three issues in this connection. Firstly, the relationship between the social and political. Second, the problem of the we, who or what is the we in SBI? And thirdly, the question of history. Now, the society-politics split is one that runs through many later thinkers. I can think of Tagore, Ambedkar, and so on. And there are different ways in which the relationships are actually stitched together or not stitched, as the case may be. It poses itself, the split poses itself as an important issue in Bhudev's thought because his Samajik Prabandha is so clearly focused on Samaj. As the essays that have been circulated have shown, among other things, Samaj is a self-governing kind of frame with a diffuse system of authority and with an ethical basis derived from a sense of continuity in time. It is separated out, and Samajik Prabandha, from sovereignty and politics. On the other hand, SBI is posited on the assumption of Hindu sovereignty. Political authority is defined by control over territory. Indeed, the narrative structure of SBI is one which jump cuts across different spaces. However, while the political is foundational, its real value lies in welding the social to itself. The different places are marked by socialization and by the life of social institutions. There are self-governing structures, but these are underwritten by political power that is directed towards controlling the social structures and their transformations. Looking back at Samajik Prabandha, I will say that the emphasis in SBI is not so much on the foundational social structures, Shastric or otherwise, but on the transformations and possibilities they unfold. The acts of socialization between Hindus and Muslims are narratively more powerful than the constitutional structures. They provide a sense of possibilities. Political authority is then, if we look back at Samajik Prabandha, is then the submerged unconscious will to complete the social self that is delineated there in the Prabandha. It is the core of the dream of the past future. And this is, just a thing that I'm trying to reverse future's past into past future, because it's kind of straddles both. At the same time, the problem it poses is one of controlled social transformation. Does this phenomenon of controlled social transformation as a corollary require a centralized sovereign authority to guarantee and guard it? So there is a political implication to this kind of controlled society, the controlled social transformations, which I want to raise as a question here. The second issue that I come to is the we, or the Shaujatiya, as Sudipto has formulated it in his essay, the we that make up the Bharatvarsha of SBI. The emphasis appears to be less on the nature of the self and really on the relationship with others. In general, there is a sense of a we that would become, over time, an internally symmetrical collective. Not pure, fully symmetrical, but on the whole, a symmetrical collective. Caste divisions and gender disabilities, both of which are justified by the problem of living under conquerors, would gradually get mitigated or maybe even die out with independence. On the other hand, there is a distinction between foreigners and the intimate other. The influence of foreigners is to be controlled, whether it's French republicanism or trade relations, even as one enters into intellectual and commercial relationships with them. On the other hand, there is an ethical relationship with the Muslim. The relationship with the Muslim is entered into in a social intercourse that is fraternal. It speaks the language of kinship, and somehow, for me, in some senses, it was playing at the back of our mind. It bears an uncanny relationship with some of the scenes of fraternization during the non-cooperation Khilafat movement, including also the language of kinship. But that's a different point. So it speaks the language of kinship in SBI and culminates in the joy of festivity. And I want to just flag off this idea of joy and of festivity, because it also links up with much of the gloss that Tagore provides as a mode of producing new collectives. These are really new, fresh collectives that fuse individuals and communities together. The idea of fraternity, on the other hand, remains a long-standing preoccupation in Indian thought, modern Indian thought, precisely because of its generative power in producing social symmetries, affective symmetries. And I just want to gesture here at Ambedkar in a very cryptic sort of way. But it plays a very, very central role in the Ambedkar, it seems to me, and of course enters into the notion of the political and of law that goes with it in a very different sort of way. Nevertheless, to return to SBI, at the same time in SBI, the Hindu-Muslim fraternization raises the issue of toleration and its underwriting by the Hindu ethos. That is, to put it at a slightly more general level, that is the problem of requiring a superior authority to actualize the ethic of social symmetry and social intercourse. So there's I just wanted to draw your attention to this kind of basic structural asymmetry that also seems to be lying at the heart of the idea of toleration that informs this fraternization. Finally, the question of history. I should say that the field of vernacular histories is one of tremendous experimentation, And the different genres in which Bhudev narrated the historicized past is a testament to this tremendous range of experimentations that are going on in 19th centuries and remains to a great extent with us. History in this sense is really a subculture. Nevertheless, I want to frame SPI in a binary opposition between two modes of history. Between, on one hand, historical progress, and on the other hand, history as the recovery of identity. It seems to me that SPI is a kind of historical tease about the possibility of remaking our past identity in the future. In other words, it posits history as not a recovery, but as a transformation of selfhood. Let me take up the instance of invasion and the motif and thematic, the recurrent thematic of invasion, which plays such a critical role in the imaginary of the political in colonized societies, especially in 19th century India, and which in our country remains, even today, as indissociable from the figure of the Muslim, from the popular figure of the Muslim. Very significantly, SPI trumps the motif of invasion by Muslims with the ethic of hospitality that makes the story of Hindus and Muslims become a history of fraternization, and which finally finds its political figure of legitimation in Akbar. The real drive of SBI, it seems to me, is to rewrite the history that could legitimize the making of a new we. The we may be, the we that we have in SBI and in Samajik Prabandho may be anchored in the prison house of Bhudev's own sociological conceptions, but its values lies in its promise of a transformative excess. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pradeep. It was very, again, very, very interesting 3 points. So now we have time open for discussion. I wanted to, before opening it, I wanted to turn to 2 people. I think Partho is here. So Partho, would you like to add something? Because you must have thoughts about this, not just about Bhudev, but about the entire field that we have opened up.
I do have a few points to make on this particular text that we are discussing. So I could do that now, or if others have more general points to make, I could come later.
No, why don't you make your points? Because I think, in one sense, it is useful to keep our focus on this particular text.
Okay.
Precisely because, Bhudev is very rich in terms of different types of arguments. So it might serve a purpose to keep the focus more narrowly on this.
Okay. So I have about 3 or 4 points to make on this. So first, of course, let me make a disclaimer. I have never been a great admirer of Bhudev. So let me just first say that. Although I've read almost the entire, I've read carefully the entire, there's a single volume of his essays which are available. I've read it quite carefully. But on the question of the form of this particular text, which Pradeep has actually written on at length, I think one of the things we should keep in mind is that Bhudev, first of all, was a government servant. He was, in fact, a fairly senior official in the education department of the Bengal government. And this particular text was actually serialized in the Education Gazette. That's a government publication. So one of the reasons why Bhudev chose this particular form could well have been a literary device, a ploy, as it were, which gives him the chance to deny authorship of this text. So this is a way in which the author could say, well, this, don't take this as the product of my conscious, rational mind. This, I have just written down something that I saw in a dream. So so that's one thing that we should keep in mind. Why this particular form? Because Bhudev's, none of his other writings have this kind of, although he's also written a novel, but none of these writings actually have this kind of, this particular literary device or anything similar, because they're all straightforward essays. So that's one. Second, I think, and this is in particular in relation to Pradeep's essay, we should bear in mind that the term, that the word that Bhudev uses for this thing, this new polity with a constitution, it is Rajya. And Rajya is the state, specifically. So he is thinking of a state. And this state is an empire. I think we shouldn't lose sight of this. This state is an empire. It is not a nation state of the modern kind. He has not imagined this. It's an empire with an emperor, and we should not lose sight of the symbolism of this meeting in the Jama Masjid, where the Mughal emperor hands over his crown and his throne to the Maratha ruler. Okay, so it's an empire with a Hindu emperor. It has chiefs, all the local rulers, all the Maratha chiefs, the Rajput princes, he mentions the Sikhs. And then there are various jatis, which he mentions, like the Marathas, like Bengalis. He also mentions, just once, I think, in the entire text, Dravid as a jati. And these are the constituents. Very often he speaks of the Pradesh. So there is no question that the structure of this new state is that of an empire. All the other states with which this state is supposed to have foreign relations, they are also empires. You have the Tsarist Empire, you have the British, you have the French, and you have the new German Empire. So there is also, very interestingly, a brief paragraph on Hindu colonies, settlements outside India, across the seas. And he specifically mentions, I think, Sumatra as this place. And he says that Hindus, this state will organize the colonization of such places because they are uninhabited. This is not by conquest. We are not going to displace anybody, but Hindus will settle these places. So that's one thing. Basically, therefore, the point being that this particular state that he's thinking about is not quite what we think of as a nation state. So that's the first point. Second, on the question of Muslims being the adopted children of the motherland, Pradeep has also already mentioned this, Shauna too. It is clearly under Hindu hegemony. There's just no question about this. That this relation between Hindus and Muslims, which is fraternal, but Hindus are the natural or biological children of the mother, and Muslims are adopted because they come from elsewhere. That's a sort of fundamental assumption. There's also, as Pradeep mentioned, a question of adopting, including frontier tribals. He talks of Hindu missionaries going out there and including them within the Hindu fold. But there is a whole argument there. I don't remember whether it's in this text or in one of the Shamajik Prabandha texts, where he speaks of them only being included at the lowest rungs of the Varna order. They cannot be allowed to go up without, he has a whole theory of rebirth and so on and so forth, when according to the kind of penance that you do in this life, you can then proceed up the Varna ladder. So, all of this is completely part of his thinking of how this state, what is this state for? What is it? What is it? What is it promoting, and what is it preserving? So, third, on Bhudev's conservatism, which, as Pradeep says, he's completely open about this. I think, and this particularly comes out in these two collections, the essays on society and the essays on the family. It's first of all, it's a rational, you might say, a modern defense of varnashram, but it is a clear defense of varnashram. It's a defense of patriarchy, absolutely no question about this. And everywhere he sets it up as a contrast between what is proper to the West and what is proper to Bharat. And what is proper is what is, he calls it shavabik, or that which is innate, that which is part of the nature, as it were. And so, for instance, something like equality, which he says is perfectly acceptable in the West, cannot be acceptable here because it is contrary to the swabhab of this jati. Okay, and so there is a clear defense of this, you might say conservative, but this is conservative not in the sense of simple Sanatan practices. Because one of the things that Bhudev is particularly clear, especially in the essays on the family and also in the social essays, that his Hinduism is characterized by for him, finally, the most superior expression of the Hindu religion is the Advaita Vedantic conception, which is again very importantly connected with his elevation of the Gita. We know this is happening elsewhere in India. Maharashtra, I think, is a very good comparison. We can come back to this point. Also, obviously, Dayanand and people like that. The Gita becomes, as it were, I think Shona was making the point. The idea that the Gita is sort of the essence of Hinduism in a single text. It sort of makes it comparable to the status of the Bible for Christians and the Quran for Muslims. He is very clear in his other essays that what goes as popular Hinduism is an inferior form of religion. That is inferior. It is possibly corrupt, and of course he has a whole argument about how one should, which is why this whole idea of Hindu missionaries and so on, trying to improve what is proper practices. The proper practices are not really acceptable as you might say advanced or superior forms of the Hindu religion. And finally, here's Brahmanism. I think we must not forget this. Again, I would compare this with similar figures in Maharashtra around the same time. Tilak or Rajwade. Brahmanism, in this particular sense, that society, he says this even in this text and repeatedly and elsewhere, that society must be led by men of knowledge. That for him is absolutely central. He acknowledges the importance of those who defend the country, the martial people. And so he mentions in this text, for instance, that the Sikhs and the Marathas must be given the responsibility of defending the frontiers. And he has, he realizes that agriculture and trade and commerce are important. Of course, foreign trade is another matter, which is part of the state. And you can think of what the European influences are on this particular idea. But in terms of inland commerce and trade and agriculture, they're clearly important. But there is almost a tone of, might even say, contempt for those kinds of people and their practices. their ethics, right? And this is reflected particularly in his critique of the British and the British rule, because for him, he clearly identifies this, that the British rule other countries for profit, that it is for profit, and this is what drives them, this kind of self-interest, which is driven by the love of wealth and gain. And there is a very, very strong Brahminical dismissal of this kind of motivation. So I think, those are the main things that I wanted to point out, because I think that, conservative thought in Bengal, for all sorts of reasons, we can talk about that, has never achieved the kind of social dominance that it did, let us say, in Maharashtra. And my sense is that Bhudev is a comparable figure to people like Rajvade and Tilak. And he doesn't go, he take it in the direction that Savarkar would do, which is formulate a clearly political Hinduism. He doesn't do that. But it seems to me that Bhudev is one of those figures in Bengal who, for all sorts of reasons in the 20th century, you could think of the enormous cultural dominance exerted by Tagore, for instance. That may be one reason, which in some senses facilitates the rise of the dominance of the left later on in the second half of the 20th century. But, and Pradeep talks about why Bhudev, for instance, is ignored. And the reason is, it seems to me, is this: Bhudev is a particularly important defender of this kind of rational modern conservatism. But I don't see him as particularly unique in this sense if you think of conservatism in other parts of India. I think there are very similar kinds of defenses made in other places as well. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Partha. And so now it's open.
One thing could I say something?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, one thing I found interesting what Partha said about the Brahminical rule basically being the most legitimate rule in Bhudev's argument. In Samajik Prabandha, there is a very interesting argument against the social contract theory, right? And where he says that in India, the social contract theory would never work because it's the Brahmins who always had the power, while the kings never had the power. And the social contract can only work in England, in Europe, because the power was in the hand of actual political rulers. So I think that's, I just wanted to say that because it seems relatable. Sorry.
Yeah. Shauna?
Yeah. Thank you. I just wanted to come in with a few thoughts, following a lot of things. And I think maybe if I could bring in a comparative perspective from Islamic political thought that, which is the area that I work on. I think while reading the text, I had a similar reading to Professor Chatterjee, that he is talking about an empire. And the idea of a political community as a nation seems to emerge more as the idea of a political community, which is that of Hindus on a land, which can then reach out, which can then reach out fraternally to people who are alien to the land, so to speak. And there are very interesting examples in the text. For example, at the start of the text, he says, when there is at the start of the text, he says, this example of a king who says, you can allow the Muslim rulers who are from India to remain in India. So there is a very interesting contradiction that is taking place at the start, and maybe it's not a contradiction. I don't know. I just want to think about it a little more productively, which is on the one hand, he is recognizing that there are Muslim rulers in India. On the other hand, there is something that is alien to Muslimness, which and Hindus have to take the responsibility of extending hospitality to this alien category. how does he resolve these? How does he resolve these two contesting ideas in his thought? The second is also, I didn't think of it as a nation, and I thought of it more as an empire because of the way in which he writes about space constantly, because spatial ideas seem to be so relevant to him in thinking about the political. Every essay starts with a spatial description of this public political space that seems to be describing his domain of in the text, and there is no sense that this might be a nation. There is very much a sense that we're talking about a city, or we're talking about different rulers meeting in one space. But there's no idea that this might be a nation. The idea of a nation comes when he's talking about land and how this land is, giving. At least that's what I'm getting from the translation. Just want to put two things out there, and just finally a third point on history itself. If we were to think about the text through Koselleck's ideas, the way in which Koselleck begins to shape conceptual history, I think, of course, there is the possibility of alternative history as a speculative horizon, and turning to the past to do so. And when we are thinking about the Islamic tradition, when people turn to the past, someone like Maulana Azad, for example, he does it by drawing on particular historical texts from within Islam. There is an imaginative leap that Bhudev is carrying out in this particular text, which in order to indicate the velocity of a certain argument. For example, the argument of fraternity, the argument of who this we is, it is necessarily an argument which has to move faster than another idea, or of a sort of idea of a community that is coming from maybe an Islamic past, which might be present in Islamic arguments around the same time. So just in terms of thinking about the way in which time is conceptualized in thinking about history as a dream, the velocity of concepts in that imaginative leap that Bhudev is making seems to be completely predicated, as Professor Datta said, on fraternity. But how does it work? It's working through all the conditions that we just discussed. Yeah. Okay.
Could I add?
Can I just clarify just one point that Shona made? How do the Muslim rulers continue? And I think Bhudev is quite clear, because this grand assembly that takes place, the Muslims are offered a choice. Those who want to leave with Abdali can leave, but those who stay, and he specifically mentions Awadh and Hyderabad, the rulers of Awadh and Hyderabad, they stay because they accept the sovereignty of the new emperor Ramchandra. They accept his sovereignty and they continue in their kingdoms. So that is the basic arrangement. Therefore, Muslims can stay as long as they accept the hegemony of this new Hindu empire. That is, I think, the basic argument.
Could I add something to it? In the sense that I partly, my reading is somewhat different on some of these issues, and I just wanted to add that. But first, let me make two or three points very quickly. I found something that Ritik said very, very interesting in the last part of his presentation, that this is the text which allows us productively to think about what are the different ways in which Indians are thinking about the ways of thinking about the past, because that's what comes out in Koselleck, that what Ritik highlighted, which I liked very much. There's a point in time with the advent of modernity in a particular society, which opens up the question of how do people relate to their past in many different ways. Precisely because of the rise of positivistic history and the claim that accompanies the rise of positivistic history, that this is the only way to do history. I think what it does is it actually forces people who are not comfortable with this, like Nietzsche, the very early example of that in Germany, to ask, is this the only way to relate to the past? Aren't there past ways of relating to the past, which were quite adequate to the past in a certain sense? They might not be adequate for us today. But those are the things that we should explore at this particular point. That's why I think in Germany, this concentration on the reflection on Historia and Geschichte emerges. And I think what is very interesting that Ritik pointed out was that in Bhudev also, not in a conceptual language, but in a certain sense, that is being explored. And the other thing which I found particularly interesting, but it struck me after Ritik made my remarks here, was how, the idea of rational prognostication is being attached to a starting point, which is explicitly a counterfactual starting point. Rational prognostication can happen only on the basis of a factual starting point. But this is a counterfactual starting point on which is a kind of pretended, rational prognostication is being attached. The other point I wanted to make, which is, I entirely agree with Partho. I think this is also an interesting thing to think about. We should not think that the state that Bhudev is thinking about is even a proto-nation state. I think he's very much like Syed Ahmed Khan, it seems to me, from this angle, that he is still thinking in terms of a world in which states are by definition imperial states. And so that's why if you think of a Hindu state in the future, the only way in which a state can exist is by being an imperial state. So you think of all the features of the imperial state. But I think what is interesting, where I agree with Bhudev, is that the we in Bhudev, as opposed to, let's say, Bunkim in Bengal or Savarkar a little later. In Bunkim and Savarkar, I think the project is to reveal a we, which is already there, which the we are not able to capture or understand. So the task of the intellectual essentially is to reveal that way, that understand that this is who we are. We do not have to become that way. We are already that way, and that should be brought out. I think in Bhudev there is much greater tentativeness to this. Probably also because of the point that Partho is making, but I'm using it slightly differently. That it is a point where, like Syed Ahmed Khan, he has a sense of the future that, that present in which we are living, which is the present of the imperial state, is going to change quickly into something which is different. But he's not very clear about what that future would be like. Now, so I think the we or Amra in Bhudev is much less determinate, and it is something which has to be created in a certain sense. And there I would say this to Shona's point, that I think land is very important for Bhudev. But I read Bhudev, here I might have a difference with both Shona and Partho. The reason why I find it interesting in Bhudev is that Bhudev is using the idea of the land which people share. They might have come from outside, etc., but they share land in the present. And sharing a land is an argument which is developed against another kind of connection, which is the connection of blood. And I have a feeling that the argument of blood, which comes from Europe, which immediately becomes very powerful in people like Bunkim and others, that is, what is the connection between a Bengali sitting in Bengal, speaking Bengali, and a Tamil man sitting in Chennai. The connection for those people is obvious. It's drawn from the European argument. It's a connection of blood of some kind. And the reason why I like Bhudev's argument is that he seems to me to be saying that, mistrust the argument about blood because that's a fraudulent connection. Because there is no blood connection. And the only way in which you can have connection between people is the connection of neighborliness. They share the land. They live on the same land. This is, and Shauna, the thing is that, the question about the nation, it's true that the text that we read does not bring it up very clearly. But I think at the very end, the very last chapter of Shamajik Prabandha, which is called Kartobya Nirnoy, what should be done, determining our duty at this point, I think he sees, because there the references are all to the Irish within the British Empire. Here I think he clearly sees the possibility of the community seen as a nation. I don't think he believes that the nation exists, but I think he understands the possibility of the nation as a kind of historical possibility. Finally, let me make a point very quickly. This is something that struck me after reading PK's paper. I wrote a paper recently meaning 2 3 years back, on conservatism. And one of the arguments I made in that paper is that it seemed to me that European conservatism is a kind of thought which is intrinsically contradictory, in the sense that if you look at people like Dimes, Bonald, etc., people who are the classical conservatives, they are people who disagree with a very big transformative event in history, sitting in a time which is after the event. And so therefore they see themselves as conservative. They say that we do not want society to change. But they're saying that, 50 years or 40 years after the event that has already changed society. So they have an image of themselves as people who are very peaceable, people who do not want any historical upheavals, etc. But the only way in which they can go back to the society that they desire is through a counter-revolution, because the revolution has already happened. So that's why I thought that European conservatism is of that kind. But reading this paper showed me, and this is a point which is made quite often by Akhil Bilkrami, our colleague in Colombia. I've taught Gandhi with Akhil. I think Partha has taught more recently with Akhil. He makes a point which I think is, in one sense, it's obvious, but it's also very important, and we do not keep it in mind. He makes this about Gandhi, but I think this is also there in Bhudev. And the similarities between Gandhi and Bhudev, I think, are very striking. That is, that if you call that structure of conservatism retrospective, that is, the French Revolution has happened, you are writing 40 years after the French Revolution, and you say that I wish history had been like this, that the revolution had not happened. But that means that if you want to go there, you have to make another revolution to erase the revolution which has already occurred, right? So that is the structure, retrospective structure of that conservatism. I think what these people are saying is, if you go back to Dipesh's point about the waiting room of history, some of these people like Gandhi, Bhudev are saying that there's an advantage in being in the waiting room of history, because you need not take the train when it comes to you. And they're in that sense a kind of prospective conservative, that they are saying that European modernity has not arrived here. It will if we do not do anything. But this is the time, if you want to avoid it, to make an intervention and try to create a future which is not like a replication of European modernity. So that's what I thought I got out of this, out of the discussion about the Shapad of the Bharatvarsha. Anyway, I've continued for too long. So Bhudev, yeah, sure.
Thank you, Sudipta. I was wondering if we could spend a little more time on the form of the piece, Shapad of the Bharatvarsha Itihash. Ritik has given us very interesting leads to think about it. Partha has also mentioned the context which might have dictated this particular form in Bhudev's writing, which is unique. He doesn't repeat it even in his novel. So what exactly is he doing formally? If we could spend a little more time on this. When I was rereading this piece for today's discussion, I was reminded of a Russian saying. I don't read Russian, so I don't know if it is true. So it can be counterfactual as well. Apparently, there is a saying in Russian where they say that the past is unpredictable, which obviously is a very political way of engaging with the past. What Bhudev is trying to do, I think even in formal terms, he is also making a political point. And how do we understand that politics? One way of thinking about it is, of course, in terms of fiction and history. I was wondering if we could go beyond that, because there is a very strong counterfactual element throughout the text, and that is what makes it very interesting to read in terms of its formal properties. One idea is what Ritik also mentioned, this easy flow of fiction and history into each other in certain Indian traditions, where the audience will intuitively know which is history, which is not. I don't think Bhudev is appealing to a kind of tradition of that sort, because he's very clearly using a frame narrative. He's saying this is Shapnolabdha, right? And there is a frame narrative where he falls asleep and then dreams this entire thing. This Shapnolabdha revealed in dream is precisely what allows us to do probably a distinction between what, on the one hand, we can call, say, fictionality or fiction making, and on the other hand, I'm borrowing a term from a very interesting recent work by Catherine Gallagher. The term she uses is counterfactual historical discourse. She's looking at contemporary fiction, of course, particularly in the US and in the UK, where you have this counterfactual narrative of what if Hitler won the Second World War? What would be something like a Nazi Germany look like? Similar things. The distinction is important because fiction or fictionality, it does not presuppose any particular sequence or order of events, but counterfactual does. It can only work if there is an already given sequence or order of events. It can only then flip that. Two major points, for instance, Pradipda mentioned this idea of fraternity. It can only happen in the text because in the given order, it's absent. Or Pathaja also mentioned that this is a kind of empire. It's a state, but not a nation state, not even a proto-nation state, but it's an empire because it can only happen with the available historical sequencing of events. There is no nation state. That's why he cannot imagine it within the text in the same way. What Gallagher also does, she identifies three major areas in which this counterfactual have been, or counterfactual narratives have been particularly popular and useful between 18th and 20th centuries, primarily in Europe and in the US, but we can also think of similar areas in this particular context. These areas are, one is philosophical discussion, especially in disagreement. The second one is military strategies, where you imagine counterfactual moves and see if the outcome would have been different. And the third one, she says, is legal debates, especially when some questions of historical injustice have been involved. So you again try to imagine a counterfactual outcome of certain legal cases. In each case, she says the counterfactual remains a political category. And one final point about this, this formal experimentation, I was thinking of another similar text in Bangla, since we are also discussing Bangla literature, which was published in 1920s, I think 28 or 29. This is by Rajshekhar Bosu, or Parashuram's Ulot Puran, or in a literal translation, it will be reverse Purana, where he imagines a reverse colonialism, where India colonizes Britain. But it also uses parody as a very strong motif inside its retelling of this reverse colonialism, which Bhudev does not. So we can probably think about these formal categories and properties a little more carefully. That's it. Thank you.
I think that's very, very interesting point. Vishnu, do you want to come in here?
Yes, I wanted to say a couple of things. One about following from Ritik and Baidik and Parthoda in the beginning, about the form of the text. I was wondering whether idea of the Swapnalabdha, that access that you as in a dream, at a writing at a time when dream and rationality are separated out, the way you access reality, is there something out there in the Puranic and other imagination? Because after all, what you obtain in a dream is not necessarily false. In fact, in a Puranic imagination, what you access through dream is actually a privileged access to a reality. For example, you find gods come in a dream and tell people that people otherwise don't have an access to. Or you have, in other words, dream doesn't lead you to a sense of falsified reality. Dream, in fact, gives you to something, an uncanny, a fantastic kind of reality, or reality that you ordinarily cannot access. So there is, my sense is that reading Bhudev, which I felt, was the form, particularly the form, which actually can be understood by looking at the Puranic and other kind of genre of writing, where dream is also connected to have an access to a special kind of truth. So therefore, the form is extremely important. So that's, I think, is again, as Ritik was saying, all the dichotomies between history writing as a product of rational exercise or as a kind of factual exercise pitted against something that you have an access. We know that Bhudev was very knowledgeable in Hinduism and so on. One can also see, I'm not sure that he's actually employing the idea of dream that you find in Advaita Vedanta, which is actually a mental construction. Is after all a mental construction. Dream and waking state and dream state both are mental constructions. And dream, particularly in the Advaita Vedantic tradition, is actually a repository of memories and what really happened in the wakeful state. So there are quite a few things I think one can connect to the genre of that writing, that whether Bhudev is playing with that kind of thing. I think maybe we can connect it to something. Finally, I thought is the distinction I wanted to. This is a question for both Pradeep or Suyutada, whoever. Is it the distinction in Bengali between Rajya and Rashtra, where Rajya is actually the state and Rashtra is the nation? Is that distinction maintained in the Bengali since the time Bhudev is writing, or this is a distinction which is worked out later? I would be curious, because in Odia the distinction is carried out, but much later the salience of that distinction comes out later in the 20th century. Although these words are often used interchangeably. I think I would stop there.
I think very interesting questions. I would go back to Ritik and Pradeep, but Partho wanted to say something, right?
No, this is just in relation to Vishnu. Two things. One on the question of Rajya and Rashtra. In Bangla, never from the 19th century to this day, the word for nation is Jati. It is not Rashtra. Rashtra is the state. So Bangla is, it used to be Assamese too. In fact, I've even seen Odia is far closer to the Marathi usage, it seems to me, because which is precisely the use of Rashtra as nation, which is now common in all of the Hindi speaking world. Hindi too, earlier on, 1920s, I've seen Hindi texts where nation is called Jati. But by the 1930s onwards, and of course after independence, now of course the standard word is Rashtra. On the dream question, I am, if Bhudev has a short foreword to this, you would have noticed, and there is no question that he is being very playful about this idea of the dream. He is never claiming this is like some kind of daiva appearing, that this is some kind of prophetic dream. None of this claim is made there. It's very, very playful. He's almost saying that, look, this is, I have devised this ploy. You can believe me or not. In fact, he's even saying, it's up to you to believe whether I really dreamt this or not. So, I think.
But Partha, that's an old ploy. What I'm trying to submit is that particular form is an old ploy. That's a long tradition of people are dreaming.
No. The people dreaming is never one which says that whether I dreamt it or not, it doesn't matter. I'm just using this playfully. The dream is taken very seriously in those texts. Here, the dream seems to be entirely a contrivance, a literary contrivance, which is to distance the author from its authorship. Yeah. So, I don't think there is any, which is why I'm reluctant. I'm very reluctant to use this in terms of some kind of older tradition of using dream narratives. I don't think this is of that kind.
Okay, Bhudev, you raised your hand, and Ranu, I'm sorry, I don't have your full name.
No, can you hear me?
Yeah, why don't you go first? And
yeah, I'm Ranu Jain.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not a political scientist, so I've left Calcutta many years back. So in fact, it was revisiting Calcutta. So my reaction is basically to this particular paper and not as such to the entire literature of Bhudev Mukhopadhyay. What I'm trying to say is that for a sociologist, what comes out very strongly is the social position from which Bhudev was speaking. He was a son of a Sanskrit, and he was a scholar of Sanskrit language. He knew English, and he was working in a government position where he had to manage the tension of not liking a particular employer with him he was working, and at the same time managing the tension that he had. And I think this whole gamut of dream came out very beautifully there, where he could say what he wanted to say in somewhat less, or I will say, camouflage language, where the critique came out much more in a melted or mellowed form, and yet he critiqued. What I found very interesting in Bhudev's vision of India, of future India, which I personally read in this dream, he was not narrating history. He was giving his vision of, what India he would like to be in, or what India's potential is. And there, what I found very interesting is, like, unlike Tilak and Bankim Chandra, his idea of Hindu Muslim was a more amiable idea. They were more cooperative, they're with each other, though Hindus were stronger and Muslims very consciously and cooperatively were giving or accepting the supremacy of Hindus, and where he in fact played with the whole notion of history of Panipat, and this whole notion of a Muslim going and giving crown to Ramchandra and things, crown to Ramchandra and other things. And also the whole notion of tribal. It seems like everyone seemed to have accepted the supremacies of Hindus and Brahmins, and they're very happy with them, and all the tribals want to become like a part of caste, and a Brahmin in a very magnanimous and very generous manner, helping them out, not only with giving them or bringing them into caste system, but also helping in bettering their life. I mean, there is a Hindu supremacy, but somewhere antagonism seems to have been managed in this dream, where Muslims and tribals have accepted their inferior position. And interestingly, in women, he has not come out in a very strong critical manner, but somewhere little bit of progressiveness in case of women is being accepted. What I find very interesting, of course, in fact, all the papers are very interesting, and I want to thank Arun for including me into this group. I found it very interesting to read the papers. But what I found very interesting is the whole notion of, in the span of time, we start somewhere in Mahabharata also, in Panipat, and then we go to the British rule, and you know how he managed the act of balancing between his conservative appeal to tradition, Hindu tradition, and at the same time his appeal to English rationality. Though he was not very happy with the kind of power the French, I mean the foreigners, and here English includes French and Germans and everyone, how he does not take it, and somewhere he sort of projects that the situation, the position that India or Hindus have is dominant, is empowering, and so even Russia and others are accepting it. I am little uncomfortable with his notion of inequality. He is critical. He is envisaging inequality and increasing inequality in the nation, but he's putting all the blame to modern technology and ownership to modern technology. And nowhere he's looking critically at the caste system, where in fact caste system, Brahmins are going to the tribals and helping them in getting into karma. I mean, in getting into caste or caste system, where it is impossible to, and it is somewhere implied very clearly, it is impossible to go up into the caste hierarchy, at least in this life, or very difficult. He did mention that if you are very educated, it is possible. But otherwise, inequality sort of prevails in terms of giving again a superior position to the Brahmins, and his whole notion of education. You know, I mean, what does he mean by when he talks about education? This education doesn't seem to be very liberating. This education doesn't seem to be equality oriented, but education is there. I mean, what I'm finding is that looking at the particular departure point from where Bhudev is coming, he is bringing in dominance of Brahmanism, but at the same time, his idea of society seemed little bit uh, more amiable, little bit more cooperative, and where I feel lies the problematic.
Okay. Boydik, if you could make your remark, because we have to get back to the three speakers. I want to give them a little bit of time at the end. Yeah. I have to, Boydik, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. Just very quick point about this idea of dream. You know, I agree with Partho that this is a very modern idea of dream. What he's doing here is not kind of a revelation by some god or by some deity, and it's a different kind of Purana or that kind of dream. What he's doing, it's counterfactual. That's why I wanted to emphasize the idea that it presupposes a particular version of history, which is, as you also mentioned, that positivist history. In one chapter, for instance, I think it's chapter 4, where the present emperor, that is Ramchandra, and his father goes and visit the grave of Akbar. There, the father narrates the situation in Bengal province, where he actually describes the history of early company rule. He mentions Clive, he mentions the incident of Shirazdullah ransacking Calcutta and the Battle of Plassey, and how Shirazdullah was defeated. This is a kind of accepted history that the text presupposes. Only then it can put forward the counterfactual argument. In fact, what he's doing, this is my submission, is not like the earlier versions of dream narratives in Indian tradition, but probably would be much closer to what he might have read in English authors, someone like Dick Quincy, for instance, or someone like Coleridge. Their idea of dream and how certain forms of histories are revealed in dream, but depending on a version of history that it presupposes. That's it. Thank you.
I just wanted to add one simple thing. I thought that there are two levels there. One is something, as Partho said, which is very similar to what Bankim does in Kamalakanta. You write something at the end, you say that, then I woke up and I realized that this was a dream. So you write and it is the responsibility for writing in a certain sense. That it obviously doing something like that.
But he's not invoking opium here.
That's right.
Unlike Bankim.
And yeah. But at the same time, I think what Vishnu said is also interesting. I agree that he's not claiming it to be that. But the three states of mind, one is the waking state, and then the dreaming state, and then the state of deep sleep. Interesting, because the dream state actually allows your mind to accomplish something, which in the active state you cannot. Yeah, Ritik, I think in a sense, some of the questions that came up were directed at you in many different ways.
Yeah, I kind of forgotten some of them, but I just wanted to comment on the dream question. What I find interesting is, of course, this I agree with what Parthoda said and what Boidik Bhattacharya said. But I just wanted to say that in 19th century narratives, right? I mean, accounts of dreams, there is a connection that you could find between, say, dreaming something and then going out and doing it in reality, right? Like, for instance, I just remember this instance from Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, where you have this dream quoted, he quotes a dream of Bismarck, right? During the Austro-German conflict of the 1860s. And, Bismarck's dreams about like going into Bohemia and defeating the Austrian forces. And he reports that to the emperor in Germany. And the emperor says, yeah, go ahead and, go to Bohemia and occupy it or something. So this sort of connection between dreaming and then, doing something like actually historically changing the course of history in a way, that could be found. Of course, this is all contrived. In case of Bhudev, it's all contrived. It's a kind of exercise which is imaginary exercise. But I'm trying to say that this is also possible. I mean, there are instances otherwise from the same century in Europe where you have this connection between dreaming and historical action. I mean, it's not that important perhaps, but it's still important to remember that we could relate this to, of course, the Indian tradition, which P.K. Datta does in his essay, right? Because that's one of the questions that came up, right? But it can also be related to what, in European traditions as well, actual dreaming and acting. So I just wanted to quickly summarize, because I thought that I didn't quite know how much time I have, so I probably rushed through. I mean, I didn't have a paper per se, but I had certain arguments. So my argument was quite simple. I thought that because there is this transition now from something called narrativism to post-narrativism, and there are different versions of it. I was thinking of looking at Indian ways of dealing with historiography, which so far has been very historiography centric, right? Sorry, history, I meant. And moving that away from that and thinking of then history as a concept which changes through time, right? And if that changes through time, then you cannot really find an immediate if you are dealing with this concept, there might not be a genre always to support that concept, right? It might be found in forms which are not supported by a genre. It could be found in some essay or some other unnatural, I shouldn't say unnatural, but unusual text. So I was thinking maybe looking at Bhudev could allow us to plot a new kind of concept. Yeah. Sorry.
No, I wanted to ask you a question, which is a methodological question.
Yeah.
Relating to what you said just now.
Yeah.
Because I think if we look at it closely, what you are saying is that what the Germans are doing in the 19th century, they see the rise of a new discourse of history. Let us call this positivistic history. But that is precisely forcing them to ask the question, what were the different ways in which people approach the past, right? And place these ways of approaching the past side by side with positivist history, right? You are saying, which I deeply respect, because I think you are saying something that is very important. You are saying that Bhudev is an illustration of somebody in India in the 19th century who is saying essentially a similar thing to the Indians, that we are now in the presence of history, positivistic history, which wants to colonize all of imaginative relationships with the past. But we have had other kinds of imaginative or conceptual relationships with the past. So let us see what they are and place them next to positivistic history. That's not my question. That is I think that is the field of fact on which you are, about which you are talking. My methodological question is that is using the German example, right, helpful or a hindrance to our recovery of the Indian concepts about the past?
It is helpful to the extent that if we can find that, which we could find, that in the 19th century Germany itself, there is no one concept, or in the 19th century Europe, there are several concepts of history which are sometimes incompatible. Koselleck calls it, I think, several zones of meaning, which sometimes are canceling out each other or something like that, right? So this kind of multiplicity, how could we then think of this multiplicity without trying to look at everything through the lens of a genre, right? Or a history of a genre, right? So that was, it wouldn't have to be, of course, a kind of replication of the same process. That's not what I'm talking about. What I was thinking of was, maybe Bhudev's somewhat unusual way of looking at the history, and this kind of alternate history wasn't there too many. I mean, I haven't read any other text from that period of this kind of alternate history, right? So it seems to me to be a very unique, conservative, of course, and there are many criticisms that can be made of otherwise the content, but it seems to me to be a unique way of addressing that question. And I was thinking of whether that could actually be looked at as a kind of shift in the concept of history itself. Maybe it's completely wrong, and I'm ready to admit it's wrong, but I thought that maybe this could be a way of looking at this text.
No, one very important thing would be to ask other people in our group about other languages, because are there texts which are like this? I think it's likely that there might be other texts. Pradeep, do you want to come in now? I wanted to go to Shona, give her a bit of time, and then give you the last word of our discussion. Okay, Shona.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you. I too didn't think of this as a presentation. I thought of it as a discussion. So I don't really have, in terms of a response. But I just wanted to come back to the discussion on Koselleck and the question of thinking about the past as a dream. I think if given the implications of Bhudev's text, we should be clear in our reading on whether the dream itself is important, because Bhudev is dreaming of a contrived past in order to outline a horizon for a future after there has been a rupture in this past because of modernity, or whether he is dreaming of ideas from presumable past that repeat and endure despite this rupture. And I think that is sort of foundational to the way in which we think about conceptual history. Conceptual history matters because of what repeats and endures despite ruptures. Whereas from Bhudev's text, there is a very clear idea of what repeats and endures, but does that give us a sort of normative idea of a concept of history that we should and ought to adopt in thinking about the past of, especially when thinking about Indian political thought? That's the sort of, just in addition to that, I think it's also about how these ruptures are thought of. In many ways, there is a signaling that there is a rupture taking place by Muslims coming to India. So the continuity of Muslims' presence in India is is not identified as a continuity. It sort of appears in the text as a rupture, at least to a reader of the translation of the text. So, I'm not a close reader in that way. I think I wanted to also think about what Professor Datta was saying about in his first point that he made about welding the social to itself, and how Bhudev is thinking about welding the social to itself. And maybe there's a way in which we construct the question which is in the passive voice, where there is the social and it has to be welded to itself. And in an active voice where the social and the itself is sort of clearly is made clear. And of course, Professor Datta brought in the point about who the we is in the process of who is the social being welded to. I too found this a very strong trope in the text. There is a sort of construction of a social which has to be welded to the self. I just wanted to bring it back in some ways because I'm wondering how that social is operating in the text. It's not merely operating through principles of the social which have to work out necessarily, but it's also operating through certain actions and acts that have to that define conduct. He and there are moments when he's talking about how I found that Jama Masjid sort of story particularly interesting because there, he says that the Muslim looked at the Brahmin in excitement and said this, and then the Kshatriya entered the conversation in a certain way. So there is the way in which the social is being constructed through those acts rather than through principles in the text seem to that was sort of particularly powerful, even though I did not find the normative idea that emerges from it necessarily something that is as powerful normatively. Just on the point about land, Professor, I don't think I had a different reading of land than from what you had. And in fact, I was also thinking about blood when I read it. I think about someone like Gila Nicha's work on it. But I think land is doing more than just, I think there is more happening in the text on whether, there is Hindus and Muslims share a land because the land is not, I think land is not just operating as a sort of trope for mutual constitutedness of this place that is India, between Hindus and Muslims. There's a certain way in which ownership of that land, not ownership, but sort of who has affiliation to the land is very much also at the forefront in the text. And I don't think we can, I think that is very much part of the question of land. So I think land is doing more than just acting as a trope for a shared space between Hindus and Muslims. So that's the sort of 3 points that I wanted to make. And I wanted to come back to, I think, some of the points that I made on Bhudev being located in a madrasa, and why that location is important, at least for me. The madrasa, shaped by texts, ideas, legal ideas that were probably circulating in that space, that were not necessarily texts that were European. So the concept, if we are going to read Bhudev through constantly by referring to him as producing a counter concept to ideas of European modernity, are we ignoring the space that is the madrasa when we are reading him? Are there other counter concepts that he is working with or against in that, in the text? So let me just, put those 4 points. I've learned a lot, so I'm not very clear. I'm still processing everything. Thank you.
Okay,
So
I think,
could I make just one quick point on the land question, as it were? I think in the English text that we have, most of the time that the word land is used for the Bangla word desh. Now, desh is actually, as you would know, almost most Indian languages, desh could refer to land, but it's also lived land. It's a lived space. And its boundaries are infinitely stretchable. I mean, it could just mean a desh, meaning one's village. It could mean a larger space. It could mean the whole country, as today one would speak of desh being, India being my desh. But here, I think, so therefore the term land here, again, I think we'd be a little misled if we think of it in the English sense of land, because the term really is desh.
Yeah, I think that is very important. The lived land, we must always, put in a bracket in front of land here and say lived. And the other thing where I entirely agree with Partha is that, if you ask the question, what kind of land, it's not bounded land in the sense that it's not land which is defined by a boundary. Lived in the sense that it's a land which is immediately present to me. And so in one context, it can be my village. Another context, it can be Kolkata. Another context, it can be West Bengal or Bengal, because I'm a Bengali. It can be India. So there's a strong identification of this land, but the identification is not by a boundary that we draw outside around it, but it is defined by a strong center and lines radiating from that in different directions. How far those lines go depend on what you want to do with the concept in that particular argument.
Which is why I think it's interesting that when Bhudev is specifically speaking of the Rajya or the state, that actually has frontiers.
That's right.
Has boundaries. But Desh has no boundaries.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Pradeep, fittingly, I think you have the last word.
No, I've really learned so much from this discussion, and it's been a very rich discussion. But let me just flag off my own kind of ways of thinking about this. And I want to take up Parthada's reading, which I agree with. And in a way, it actually, I think it was Parthada himself who kind of introduced me to this text, actually. And, because he possibly found it intriguing. And I want to take that sense of intrigue up. Because while I agree with Parthada and with Ranu and, and with most kind of thinking about it as a sociological text, and there's clearly, I mean, at least I cannot sympathize with most of the kind of sociological positions and frameworks that he's kind of putting forward in this text. Nevertheless, what I do feel, and this I think comes from the form itself, is that there is a certain incertitude in this text. And there's a constant, certain teasing sense of incertitude, which I think needs to be looked at a bit more sympathetically. Because while all these are given, and he's very open about all of this, it's, it doesn't quite completely follow from that this is a fully conservative text, in that sense. So let me just flag off a couple of things which I think intrigue me and keep intriguing me about this text. One is this idea of dream. Let me start with that. And the dream as counterfactual. I mean, it seems to me that there are two levels at which the dream operates. One, I think Parthada has very correctly put it. It operates like as a form of disavowal, a confession which is a disavowal at the same time. So it's really something like analogous to a secret that everybody knows, we all know, but we won't talk about it in a certain sense. So it's revealing and concealing at the same time. So, and it's a great kind of literary sort of way to get around censorship and that sort of stuff. But also I thought that at another level, not deeper or whatever, but at another level, there is a notion of dream as resolution, as something that can be, which I think, going back to what Shauna was also saying, something to be acted on. And I was actually relating that to Yudhishthir and the way he dreams, and also to some of, at least in my essay, on some of the kind of personal relationship with dreams that Bhudev has. And this seems to me very a kind of dream that is different from, say, Rajshekhar Boshu or Sultana's dream, Begum Rokeya Hussein's, which again has this kind of satiric aspect, or Coleridge, which has moral, ethical truths in this dreamlike sort of scenario, or dream as in the way that is discussed in many of the philosophical traditions, which is really a question of knowledge. How do we know that this is true or not true, and so on and so forth, and many of the kind of discussions on that. So it seems to me that this is a very interesting kind of thing, because it's a dream of history. And here again, the whole idea of history, but it's a history that's narrated in realist terms. In that sense, is borrowing from positivist traditions as well. So in a way, it's counterfactual in that sense, as Boydik had said, that it's reconstellating the factual, but as an imaginary. And I think that is a very interesting tease and a very unique kind of scenario, where it's not just, it doesn't seem to me, I mean, it's analogous to prognosis, but not quite prognosis in that sense. It's more, that's, I think, more closer to a romance, to a wish fulfillment, and stronger than a romance in the sense of a resolution, hopefully a wish fulfillment that will lead to a resolution kind of thing. And of course, folding back on itself and changing history also in that sense, in that same move. So these kind of paradoxes with which it plays, and there's, I think, a great sense of play in Shopnolapto, which I think is something that we need to also, which is very contrary to Bhudev's own character and the way he constructs his other texts. A second point where I think there is a certain incertitude in my mind is the notion of change. This idea of controlled change, of which is actually can be divided into two kind of segments, of something foundational and then something as transformative, that is responding to what is contemporary or what is future. And this you'll find, for instance, to a great extent, I mean, the structure to Ram Mohan, but also more interestingly with the Islamic tradition in modernity. And so Setsar Sayyad and all of these people, because they're constantly talking of certain foundational principles of Islam and how are improvisations and to be kind of selected. So what is bidat and what is not bidat and what is just and jazz and so on and so forth. So in a way, this is working within that structure. And I do think in a way that space is being used to control time. There are kinds of, the whole thing is in terms of spatial, and I think it's absolutely right. But in a way, it's trying to freeze time, freeze those actions, that are. But I think there's an incertitude there, because the actions tend to outstrip, it seems to me, the foundations in a way that is not quite there in Samajik Prabandha, where there is a kind of control over what will be transformed or what is the epistemic framework of transformation. Here, the actualities of transformation seem to exceed the foundational aspects. And that's why that sense of the we, the expandability of the we becomes, again, an uncertain but interesting incertitude, a point of incertitude. Thirdly, I feel And I'll just come back to the we a little bit later and the nation and the empire question. On again, an incertitude about the Hindu-Muslim relationships. I mean, there's absolutely, undoubtedly, is very frank about Hindu hegemony, about Hindu toleration, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's very clearly, conservative sort of thing. But what also intrigues me is the fact that you should go to Akbar for legitimation of this new empire or whatever, this new polity. And Akbar is the critical legitimating point. And it is preceded, this empire, the political authority, the first act is that of fraternizing between the Hindu and the Muslim, which does establish some kind of an affective symmetry. Now, all of this is within the aegis of Hindu toleration, and there's an ethical action and counteraction, and all of that romance elements are all there. But within those romance elements and within the framework of Hindu hegemony, there's also a different possibility that is being, in retrospect, is being hinted at. At one level, the possibilities can go towards some idea of what Savarkar has talked about, of the Hindu being the blood and so on and so forth. But the other possibility is something that goes towards, I mean, I'm reading it a little ahistorically, but retrospectively, in terms of a federated kind of unity that I had actually thought about in terms of non-cooperation Khilafat movement, where you have an asymmetric federation in a certain sense, but a federation that allows for certain kinds of socializations to happen and so on and so forth. So there is again an incertitude. And of course, we must remember that Bhudev is imagining all of this. So there's bound to be, I think Shauna had mentioned this, and Ritik had kind of also gestured at it. There's always this incertitude about what may happen in the future. And it's obviously bound to be there. And finally, this whole thing of empire, I think it's excellent. I mean, quite a very major point that Partha has made. But I'm still, I mean, I need to work this out a bit more in my mind. But I still think there are elements of what the imaginary of the nation may be. There is, and I think that has important consequences later on, and for even for today.
Pradeep, could I
Sorry.
Interrupt and ask you a question about this, because that you can respond to that. If you bring together what Partha said, which is quite true, if you read Rajyo in this text, obviously Rajyo actually means a pre-modern state, right, which has a Raja. So it's a pre-modern state, let's call it an empire. But if you think of the last 3-4 chapters of Samajik Prabandhan, and think of the constant references to his conversations with Irishmen who are working as servants of the British Empire, who are his colleagues, and his constant, slightly humorous references to them, that if you scratch them a little, they would of course say to you that we are all British and I'm part of British identity, and I have no sense of discrimination that I'm an Irishman, etc. Right? And he gives many references where he has a conversation, and he basically says that if you scratch them, then immediately you will see a certain expression of Irish nationalism.
Right.
So don't you think that this is what I was trying to say, that Bhudev Mukhopadhyay or Syed Ahmed Khan, etc., they are at a moment in history, where they can see that they exist in a world which is the world of the nation state, a world of the empire, the British Empire. But even inside the British Empire, already in the Irish and prospectively with the Indians, you have the rise of something for which our anachronistic characterization would be that it's a sense of nationalism.
I would agree with you there, in the sense, I mean, again, I can't quite clearly formulate it in that sense, but I think there is a certain movement from empire as its foundation to a sense of the nation. And I see that firstly in this kind of notion of this fraternization, but also this kind of progressivist kind of narrative of caste division slowly disappearing under this new regime, women coming out in public. And, there is a whole sense in which there is a kind of a joining up in a way that the empire doesn't quite afford. That the figure of the empire, even to, let me say, things like the colonial question, he's actually comparing himself with nation states there, and how India would not colonize but colonize at the same time, so that they would see the Bharatvarsh as the motherland. Again, this motherland concept is again pretty important in that sense. So, what I was just trying to say is there's this incertitude is actually quite an interesting one, including also Assam and this Brahmanization of Assam and all of that, because in a way, this kind of wrestling between empire and nation is something maybe that, and I'm speculating here, but that may actually underlie many of the debates around federalism and ways in which, right from the partition days, and in fact before that, we've been trying to kind of negotiate this whole thing. And, of course, so much of India is constantly going up in flames. But this whole thing of, is this a nation? Is this something that resembles an empire? We're not quite decided, and that undecidability is something which I think we can find in a way foreshadowed in Bhudev. So in a way, the way I read this text is really a kind of very important structurally for some of its formulations of undecidable,s rather than a completely clear conservative manifesto, if you like. Yeah, so it's, for me, it's a question of the reading approach. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you to all of you, particularly to Pradeep, Ritik, and Shona for your presentations. I think you would all agree we had a very rich discussion. It can continue indefinitely. I hope it does. In fact, what we can do is we can think of whether we should have think of some kind of written version of some of these discussions if we consider them to be fruitful. But I have had a few discussions with with Arun, and I wanted to report that very briefly in 2 minutes. On two things. We've been thinking of what can be text that we take up for reading, and our understanding is always limited in terms of the language and what we have read. I suggested to Arun that we should, of course, put a stop to the Bengali thing, and we should go into a different language. I suggested Namwar Singh's Dusri Parampara Ki Khoj, because it is, to me, it's a very interesting and important book. It also, in a certain sense, connects to his teacher, Hazari Prasad Dwivedi, and his understanding of the Indian tradition. I think it's a very interesting text because it's very subtle in using Indian aesthetic categories, but it's also enormously well read about Western aesthetic thought, structuralism, and things like that. So we thought of that, but I think it's very important for us to have a list of texts that we can read and which come from different parts of the country, especially very important to have suggestions coming from the South. And I think one thing that we had in mind in organizing this group was that we should not read the texts which are conventionally read. So that's why it's very important to get suggestions from people who come from those regions and who know the vernacular texts very well, and who alone can actually say that, well, there's a text like this in Malayalam, or there's a text like this in Assamese, or there's a text like this in Marathi. which is not part of the standard text that we use. So please send suggestions. Arun, should they be sent to you?
Yeah,
They can be sent to Arun and me together. So that's one thing. And the other thing that we have been thinking of was whether we should not think of a website of Indian social thought, where what we try to do is to simply put up on the web uh, for access to people wherever they sit in the world, the vernacular copies of the text. And if there's a translation, then of course a link to the translation and things like that. In fact, Sanskritists have done wonderful work with things like that. That you can go into, you can go into a website, and all the texts that there exist on Ayurveda, either you will have the text itself, or you have a link, you have a bibliography. So I was suggesting to Arun and also to Vishnu. I think Vishnu is not here now. But this is actually a request to all of you who are based in India to approach your institutes, universities, etc., to say that, well, if you are based in Benares, then have a website of Hindi social thought. And if you are in Karnataka, have a website on Kannada social thought of this kind. It is just the text, so that, if somebody is interested, they can go into that. So if you have any suggestions regarding that, you could also probably send it to us. And it's not that we are trying to set up a big center for initiatives, but Arun said that he would be interested in pursuing that possibility of Indian social thought kind of thing. So if you are interested, if you think that it is worthwhile, you should probably send us suggestions.
There's an excellent example, which is for Urdu literature mostly, Rekhta, which we all know probably. I found it very helpful. So
absolutely.
That could be a model of sorts.
And
but I mean, that's too big a model, of course. It takes too much labor for that kind of thing. But
no, but the thing is, what I felt was that given the state of our country politically now, any initiative that you take is bound to be shot down because some people would say that it's against this government, that government, etc. At the same time, I think compared to the situation when I was in JNU, now the universities have some resources. And sometimes they have piles of resources which are never used. The ministries have resources like that. And some of my old IAS officer students have come to me and said that, we have this huge fund of money. Can you give me a suggestion about what I can do with it? And if had been now, I would have said that, do that for your region and your language. So something like that, it's just a kite flying still. But if you have any ideas about that, I think we should have a conversation about that. So Arun, next time, should we have Dusri Parampara?
Yeah, we'll have Namar Singh.
But the thing is that, we do not have anything now for the next meeting. So please, send us suggestions.
We'll have, I already spoken to people. Let's see if they are willing to present.
On Namar Singh.
Namar Singh, yeah.
No, I mean after that.
After that, yeah, we can plan again, but let's go step by step, incrementally.
Yeah. But we need suggestions, because otherwise I can give suggestions which are only from Bengali and Hindi.
True.
Right. So we need suggestions from people from other regions.
Yeah, we'll do that. We'll do that. Okay, so thank you all. So we'll meet next round, maybe for 3 months.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.